Should I refer to you as Rabbi Levy? Is that?
Or Richard is also fine.
Okay, wonderful. Well, Rabbi Levy, first of all, I want to begin by thanking you so much for agreeing to be interviewed. This means so much to us, the entire state, the entire nation, and I want to thank you for the stand you took and your commitment to social justice.
Thank you. There were a lot of other people involved who worked much harder and suffered much more, and it's lovely that you all are doing all of this to record it. It's a movement that is already starting to get both murky and misty in people's minds, and it's important to remind people of some of the sharp edges of it, and so this is good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, sir. Well, I wonder if we could start with, we're talking with people in different movement kind of locales, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, and one of the questions we're trying to get to is kind of a family history question in a sense, like what was it in your family background, or was there anything in your family background, in your heritage, so on and so forth, which kind of leads you to St. Augustine in 1964?
That's an interesting way of putting the question. My parents, they used to say we're a mixed marriage. My mother was a Democrat, my father a Republican, but a very liberal Republican. And during the Second World War, or before it, I guess, they had tried to bring some people over from Europe to Rochester, New York, where they were living. They weren't successful, but they worked hard to try to do that. They had founded a synagogue when I was a young teenager. So they had been involved in these things. But the most direct causes that brought me to St. Augustine were some of my experiences in that rabbinical school. I had just been ordained 2 weeks before I came down here, and I had been involved in protest marches outside the Woolworths in downtown Cincinnati, in solidarity with the sit-ins that started at Woolworths. And in a visit to a friend in Chicago, my first year at the Hebrew Union College, he had become involved in the NAACP, which at the time was considered a radical organization. And that really opened my eyes to a world that, as college students in the 1950s, had really been closed to us. So I came back to Cincinnati determined to do something there, and that was what led me to get involved in the picket lines outside of Woolworths. In my last year as a rabbinical student, I lived in an apartment house in Cincinnati while being on the border of the South. Was also an integrated city. Most students lived in integrated apartment houses, as did I. And so there was an African American who lived there, and he and I spent a lot of time together. We would go on some of the picket lines together, and he. And then in my last year, I had a student pulpit in Jasper, Alabama, which is a suburb of Birmingham. And that was a searing experience because I both got to know my Jewish congregants, but I also spent some time in the African American part of town, and talked every time I was there with the principal of the high school. And in fact, we had arranged for a commemorate. It was also the year that John Kennedy was assassinated. And we had arranged for a memorial of the youth group at the synagogue, at which the black principal would speak. But their parents were smarter than I was, and they manipulated it so that the principal was disinvited in, of course, a very polite way. So all of that had been in the back of my mind when I went 2 weeks after I was ordained to a convention of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the Reform rabbinical organization. And a telegram was read out from Martin Luther King asking rabbis to join him here and to integrate the motel and probably to get arrested. And given all that I had been doing in the past few years and having no good reason to say no, I had nothing else to do. So I went. And it was, of course, one of the great experiences of my life.
You mentioned the picketing at Woolworths in Cincinnati. What was that about? What was that struggle?
Well, there developed a nationwide boycott of Woolworths in solidarity with the young blacks who had integrated the counter, I think in Greensboro, North Carolina. And so because Woolworths refused to serve them, a nationwide boycott developed. I don't remember anymore who had organized it. But we, as rabbinic students, we were studying the prophets and the prophetic call for justice that was very important in the Reform movement, as well as to Jews in general. And several of our professors were quite supportive. And ultimately, so was the president of the college supportive. He received a call from the head of the Jewish Community Relations Committee who was upset that we were doing it, but he refused to ask us not to do it.
Who was the president, sir?
Nelson Glick at the time.
Were there, you mentioned professors who were supportive. Were there professors that inspired you in terms of the calling for social justice?
No, I mean, the inspiration really came out of my visit to my friend in Chicago. And it also introduced me to the work of Saul Alinsky, who, as you know, sort of founded modern community organizing in this city, and he had a group in Chicago. And I'm still involved with community organizing. The Reform movement has committed itself to that as well.
With the Industrial Areas Foundation?
Yes.
One more stop before we get to St. Augustine proper. Now, you mentioned Jasper being a searing experience. Could you elaborate a little more on your experiences in Jasper, Alabama?
Sure. You know, it was the first time I had ever lived in the South, and while I was just down there for a weekend a month, but I was there for the whole 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And at the hotel in which I was staying, there was an African American who worked there, and we got to talking, and either I had asked him if he could take me up to where he lived, or he had offered. I don't remember anymore. And the area where blacks lived in Jasper was called Coke Oven, and it was a dismal place. The high school wasn't called a high school; it was called a training school. And the principal was obviously fighting a very hard battle to get his students to seek higher visions than they had to be raised on. So there was that part of it, and the other part was seeing how fearful my congregants were, that they felt caught between non-Jewish whites and blacks. And Jasper seemed to me to be a beautiful, at least in the white part of town, safe, quiet town. They had triple locks on their doors. And the fear was, and just the little things of a segregationist life. The president of the congregation, a lovely man, just the sweetest man around, would not shake hands with blacks. And the first time I watched that, him just not extending his hand was just searing. And he and I had walked around downtown, and we had heard at the hotel that Kennedy had been shot. And that there had been a lot of negative press coming out of Birmingham about Robert Kennedy, particularly. And so somebody whom the president spoke to, and you may recall that Governor Connolly of Texas was in the car with Kennedy. And when our president told this man about what had happened, he said, "I sure feel sorry about Connolly." And of course, one sees that now with Obama. So things have changed radically. There's still a lot of underlying issues going on.
You had mentioned hearing this call from Dr. King's, and it was specifically aimed at a faith community which he was trying to kind of spur to action. What was do you remember your initial kind of response to that call?
My initial response was sort of terror and feeling I have to say yes to this. And I can't think of any excuses not to. My summer job didn't start for, I don't know, a month or so. It was made clear we would be in jail just for a couple of days. It was clearly the right thing to do. I mean, it really was a call that I had to say yes to. I had never been in jail. I had grown up, in fact, as somebody with a lot of fears. And in connection with that, I mean, one of also my memories of being here was I was one of the last to be booked into the jail. And so I was standing around on a little piece of grass outside the jail, and outside the cell where the African American civil rights workers were kept is the word. They were packed into this room. It was just absolutely inhuman. And so, and I still don't know whether this fellow was teasing me or not, but he said, you know, that place where you're standing, the Klan often comes out to practice in the afternoon. So as I say, I didn't know whether he was just teasing me or whether in fact they did. So I was thinking, I've been frightened of much less serious things growing up. I guess I can face this. So.
Now, Rabbi Levy, obviously not everyone went to St. Augustine after getting the call. Can you talk about the process of kind of the organizing, like how you ended up, like who you spoke with, and kind of the mechanics of getting down here?
50 years can dull the memory. I don't remember a lot of the details of how it went or how we signed up or who we talked to. Rabbi Dresner was sort of the coordinator of all of this, and the telegram was either sent in care of him to the CCR. So in some ways I connected with him and said, I want to go. And we were on a bus. We flew to Jacksonville, and someone from the Anti-Defamation League picked us up and drove us to down here. But I don't remember all the exact details, I mean, there were a lot more than there were 16 rabbis and Al Vorsman, who was the head of the Social Action Commission and a major figure in the reform movement and social justice. There were a lot more than 17 at the convention. There were several hundreds. But, people have other lives, and I was not married, and I had no responsibilities, and it was obviously something that was important to me, so I went.
When you got to Jacksonville and as you moved into Florida, did the rabbis begin talking with each other about, maybe second thoughts or strategy or what was going to happen or apprehension?
I don't think anybody had second thoughts. I think we had all, even in the brief time, thought it through and decided this was right to do. Again, I don't remember anything about the plane flight or the trip down here. What I remember is the incredible greeting that we got when we walked into St. Paul's Church. Is that the name of it? I mean, people were whooping and hollering and shouting hallelujah. It was, I mean, they were so glad to see us, and we knew that, part of the issue was that the black civil rights workers often felt invisible. I mean, Ralph Ellison wrote a book about that. And that nobody knew about what they were going through, and so whenever the violence or the marches would go on television, or in our case in the press, it just helped to validate their sense that what they were doing was being noticed and that they weren't suffering for naught. So our coming there from really all over the country, from the north particularly, was clearly something that uplifted them, and my heavens, it certainly uplifted us. And all of us felt, I mean, it's part of the letter, felt that we hadn't done enough. And that, we all felt, look, this was 2 days, we were in jail overnight. Don't make more of a deal of this than it was. And it was that it was important for the people who lived here and who were risking their lives here. We saw people poked with electric cattle prods, just as one saw on television and read about. So our feeling was that it was worthwhile for that we weren't just doing it to salve our own consciences.
You mentioned walking into the African American church, and I'm assuming that all of the rabbis went in together
Yes.
to the church. Could you describe the scene and your feelings and what it meant to you?
I don't think any of us had ever had that kind of welcome before in our lives. I mean, these were, quote, strangers. We were strangers. We were of different races. We were of different religions. And yet, at that moment and for the whole time we were here, we were part of one community. The next day, and we slept in the homes of members of the church, and which I guess was in
Lincolnville, yes, sir.
In Lincolnville, which was integrated. Because there were whites walking around the streets and blacks, and whenever I would see a white face that morning, I would feel very anxious. When I saw a black face, I felt relieved. And growing up in the North, that was not my experience. And that was also a revelation. This was a communion of souls, and souls don't have color. And or souls have many colors, and that that welcome into the church was a reminder that we had common souls and in a common creator of souls. I mean, we had probably all been in black churches and been at services there, but to see that kind of enthusiastic response directed at us was brand new. And I think, you know, I don't know how much of this we or I felt at the time, but the sense that it was Dr. King who had issued the call, but he was an agent of God who had spoken to a whole tradition of Jews saying, you know, remember, you were slaves in Egypt, and that has always to be with you. And it was certainly there when we came here.
Now, by the time you arrived here, the movement had been going on for several months, and you talked about walking through Lincolnville and seeing people and beginning to kind of gauge the atmosphere. Can you describe what the atmosphere was like here, and did it match your assumptions kind of coming from outside?
Well, you know, after we from the church, as I recall, and we got there in the afternoon. From the church, we went on this march downtown, and last night when Stuart drove me down, I guess, Route 1, or the main drag that still has the slave market there. And I remembered the march last night. And, oh yes, we turned on the main street there. I didn't think I would. And that was a very scary march. It was dark, and all the Southern stereotypes that were there, heavy mimosa moss hanging down over the fences and so forth. And out in the darkness somewhere, the Klan had gathered for its own march, and there were National Guard troops somewhere in the dark. But I was mostly conscious of this very heavy silence. And we were each paired up with someone from the church, and I was holding the hand of, or was being held by, a girl, I don't know, she couldn't have been older than 8 or 9, who was absolutely terrified. And I was a big man, so my job was to ease her fears. I was terrified myself, and she was very good for me. And a lot of us had that experience, that our job was to ease other people's tensions, and you know, the sense was we were on a holy mission, and it would work out, and ultimately it would work out that this cause would succeed. So that was the march, and then we went home to different people's homes who, you know, were incredibly hospitable to us. Sometimes 2 or 3 of us would stay.
Whose home did you stay
I
in?
don't remember the name.
But it was a positive experience.
Oh my heavens, it was lovely. It was lovely. And then in the morning, as I say, we walked out, and there were blacks in the street and whites in the street, and I had that experience of identifying with people who didn't look like me.
Had you ever been arrested before up to this time?
No. My mother, who told Jewish stories really wonderfully, said that once I got home safely, she said, so first he's ordained, and 2 weeks later he's in jail. That sort of summed up that part of the experience. I was the youngest of all the 17, and there were some of the people there were among the leaders of the Reform movement at that time.
Could you describe maybe the lead up to the action? I mean, did you pray? Did you kind of prepare yourself emotionally, spiritually?
There was a service at the church. The rabbis didn't pray, at least publicly, until we were in jail. And Dr. Borowitz led the service, which I had forgotten, but in looking at these memoirs of people with whom I was jailed, he had mentioned that the sweet story that I shared this morning. That so he had led the evening service, and then I don't remember who led the morning service, but we were in the morning service. I mean, we were all struck by the lines in the prayer book praising God in Hebrew, Matir Asurim, who frees the captives. And in fact, I think the letter ends with that, because that was, we hadn't seen ourselves on the other side of that line before. So in this life, I hadn't been in jail before, but in other lives, I have.
What was the experience like? You mentioned there's a sense of fear in the city. Did that carry over to the action? Were you kind of scared?
Yeah. Well, the action being at the motel in the morning.
Yes, sir.
Interesting question. I don't recall feeling scared in the morning. The march was scary because it was dark and we didn't know exactly who were out there. But sunlight does a lot to melt fear. And we knew what was going to happen. We knew what was going on. And the closest I got to Dr. King was watching him leaf through his Bible looking for a psalm to read at the sort of gathering before people went into the pool or went into the restaurant. And that was very moving to me because it was a reminder that he was a pastor and an incredible preacher. I hadn't remembered the psalm, and looking through some of my colleagues' reminiscences, one of them did remember it almost. It was 2 psalms away from what he quoted, what the psalm was, 27, which for us is a very important psalm because it's the psalm which we say every day in the month before Rosh Hashanah through Sukkot, and I doubt that he knew that. And as I say, I didn't remember what the psalm was, but now, and that was interesting actually. It's a reminder that things don't only happen at the time that they happen. I mean, that event has been clearly informed, for me at least, by this event. I didn't know what the psalm was. And knowing what it was and what its meaning was to the Jews who were there gave that choice and that reading even more meaning. So one should invite people back 50 years after every significant event so they can really understand what happened.
As the day progressed, did you get a sense to kind of read each other's feelings, or can you kind of describe the kind of general sense of?
Well, there wasn't a lot of time at the motel read people's feelings. I mean, things happened very quickly. The police were there with their patrol wagons, either the police or the sheriff. I mean, I'm not sure how things were divided up. We knew that the sheriff was himself a Klan member and that they were all very close with the Klan. And I think the Klan leader was sitting in the jail when we were there. And apparently his family still live here. And I've wondered what kind of conversations may have been had between them and blacks who live here and white liberals. So, I mean, there were people who jumped in the pool. I remember I was outside, so I didn't see people sitting at the counter inside. But we were instructed to not go willingly into the patrol wagons, but to go limp and force the police to carry us in. Well, that was an interesting experience. I mean, they were gentle. They weren't mean. I don't know. I couldn't see how they were when they carried the black workers in, if they, treated them differently. But when our wagon when our car was filled and they slammed the doors, the blacks that we were all sort of on the sitting on the floor of the back of this car. The blacks in the car just let out a whoop of release, which showed how tense they had been up until this time. I mean, they had planned to be arrested. That's why they came down from all the places that they came to, and this was what they had come for, and that was remarkable. It was just a shout of hooray, and also I think a shout of victory. We forced them to carry us in. And for them, white people don't carry black people all so often. And I forced them to carry me into this truck. I didn't come of my own accord. And so that sense of victory and that release and triumph was just remarkable to experience. And that was clearly different. I mean, for me at least, it was another stage on the way to jail. But for them, it was clearly the climax of everything that led up to that. And they had been in jail before. They knew what that would be. And so this was another success. And of course, they were absolutely right. It was a victory. And victory after victory after victory finally brought about the big victory.
Rabbi Levy, I remember being involved in a nonviolent civil disobedience protest of the United Farm Workers in the 80s, in which I was arrested, actually alongside my future wife. We went to jail together, actually.
Oh, wonderful.
The thing that was striking was the interaction with the jailers, and they really they began by trying to give us a hard time, and what are you guys doing? You're just a bunch of, Do you remember any interactions you had with the jailers or with the police after you were put into the van? Like, did they try to talk with you, or did they just kind of process you?
They didn't spend a lot of time talking with us, as I recall. My memory is that they were hostile to us and we were hostile to them. I mean, that a jail should be run by the Ku Klux Klan was just outrageous, even in 1963, just outrageous. And I think we felt the sense of outrage. When I found out that the head of the Klan's family still lives here and operate markets and so forth, and I looked in the phone book, and there are a lot of them. Apparently he had a lot of children. I was thinking, what must that be to live among people who have oppressed you? We spent some time in Germany, and it would be like living down the street and shopping in the stores of people who would send your relatives to concentration camps. I think they weren't that bad, but it's hard for me to imagine. And so, I mean, coming back here, the sense of living with this past, and having to share the same beautiful city with people who had so scarred it 50 and more and fewer years ago, must be very difficult. And even to think, the person who drove me here mentioned that when they cut entrances from Route 1 that led out on King Street, named for Martin Luther King, they cut it away from Lincolnville, or from the main part where blacks lived. And that was much more recently than 50 years ago. So things are still going on.
Right. We, the letter I was...
And lest I sound like, you know, I live in Los Angeles where everything is wonderful. There are terrible problems with the treatment of undocumented immigrants in Los Angeles and California and all places on the border. That's an ongoing disgrace in this country. The whole issue with guns, and that this is the only country of our size that has had a major wide-scale murder every month, and that our lawmakers are not willing to do something about it. That's not a problem just in Florida. So all of us are sitting on ghosts, and some of the ghosts are very real.
You're right, they're national. I mean, we feel these things grievously in this state with the murder of Trayvon Martin, and so many of our students were involved in nonviolent civil disobedience around that, you know, sitting in Tallahassee. And growing up in Florida, you're right. I mean, it's St. Augustine and Miami and Jacksonville. I mean, there's still a palpable sense of history. You just can't escape it. You can try to escape it.
Right.
But
Yeah.
Like Banquo's ghost, it does not down.
Right.
I wonder if we could talk about the letter.
Yes.
It's such a, I mean, let me just begin by saying, to me, I mean, I've been teaching history for many years. I mean, I feel a calling to do it, but this is one of the most eloquent documents I've read in my entire life.
It really was, and I can say that because my memory is that the younger folk had very little to do with it, that it was mostly the work of Borowitz, Brickner, Lippmann, and Jick, and maybe some other people. So yes, I agree. It's a gorgeous letter, and I was happy to be dragged along as a signator.
So that was my next question, was the kind of, if you could discuss the role of each individual, not in tremendous detail, I realize it's a lot of people, but like how the letter came together, kind of the spirit of writing this.
Look, you know, we were rabbis, and rabbis write and speak. And at some point we knew that we wanted to write about this, both for history, both because several of, actually a lot of our number were going back to congregations who weren't also happy that their rabbis had been in jail or had participated so publicly in civil rights. And I think they wanted to make a case for their own participation that they could bring with them when people would say, why did you do this? Why did you do this? So that was one thing. Rabbis express themselves in words, and we happen to have some very talented writers. I mean, one of them, Gene Borowitz, basically wrote the set of principles for the Reform movement in 1976, the so-called centenary perspective. So this sort of was a writing exercise for him to. And the closing, the prayer praising God, Matir Asurim, who releases the captives, came out of our own sort of spontaneous response to that in the service. And I'm pretty sure that Borowitz had the pen in his hand, and that he sort of coordinated it, and we would come up with suggestions. And it was the cell. I mean, it was a spacious cell. The drawing that gentleman made shows us being much more crowded than at least I remember we were. The black civil rights workers were really crowded. Maybe 30 people, 50 people into a room this size. But we had space. We even had a shower, no shower curtain. And in fact, Rabbi Setcher took a shower, remember that? And it was such a relief because it sprayed water on us, and it was just so incredibly hot and humid. And they gave us jars of baby food, which, as people have said when I've told them that story, they said, well, that was all right. I mean, it was clean, it was sanitary, it was closed up, and that's true. But at the time, we just saw it as an insult, and of course, there wasn't very much of it. That old joke. The food was terrible and there wasn't enough of it. I'm sorry. And there was one light in the jail cell, outside of the cell, and that the picture, the drawing it points up, and it was by that light that we wrote the letter. So there wasn't very much light, and I mean, it was, none of us slept that night. It was probably 2 or 3 in the morning that we worked on the letter.
So there's a sense of adrenaline
yes.
Yeah.
Right, and of I mean, as is true with anybody who writes, writing is a way of gaining some control over things going on in your life. And that was important to us too. We wanted to interpret the events as to how we saw them, and we knew that there were always people at that time who would criticize Northerners for coming south and then going back home. Oh, you did it to salve your own conscience, as I mentioned earlier. And we acknowledge some of that. It ends with this beautiful sentence about hoping that God will forgive us for all the things we have not done before and since. So we wanted to acknowledge that, but also to acknowledge that we came for reasons. And yes, we came because we had huge respect for Martin Luther King Jr. And that was a factor. There was an editorial somewhere, I don't remember anymore, and the title in a Jewish publication, perhaps not, perhaps, When the King Calls. And it was basically saying, yes, you'll do his bidding. And so that sentiment also was, yes, we had huge respect for him. And we had huge respect for our own tradition, which his call spoke to. And that was one reason why I used the excerpt from him that I did this morning before we sang the song at the sea, showing his own respect for, as my wife puts it, our story of the Exodus.
When in rereading the letter, it's so striking. There's a sense of, there's passion, there's commitment, there's courage, but as you mentioned, also a tremendous sense of humility, and a realization that people have been fighting and dying in this movement, and we're in it for this period of time, but don't forget that it's an ongoing struggle. I want to read a brief passage of the letter and ask you to kind of comment on it, maybe in the context of what's happening today, or maybe your thoughts. And the passage begins, "We came because we could not stand quietly by our brother's blood. We had done that too many times before. We have been vocal in our exhortation of others, but the idleness of our hands too often revealed an inner silence. Silence at a time when silence has become the unpardonable sin of our time. We came in the hope that the God of us all would accept our small involvement as partial atonement for the many things we wish we had done before and often."
It's really beautiful. I wrote none of that, so I can. It's beautiful, right?
What does it say to us now? This passage, the letter.
Look, Ben Shahn did a series of prints for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference around this period that they used to raise money from, and I bought a set of them. And one of them that hangs in my office says, "Thou shalt not stand idly by." And it remains the case. We were speaking about immigration issues, and there are people who say, "Well, our ancestors came legally." Yeah, they came legally because this country needed their labor. So are you saying that it's the government that decides whether immigration is legitimate or not? If labor is needed, why then it's okay. But if it's not, then no, that's very bad. Well, no, that shouldn't be the basis on which we decide if it's right for people to come here or not. My heavens, I'm a member of a group in California which of Reform rabbis and lay people which had been working for specific kinds of legislation, of which for a year and a half we were working to pass something called the Trust Act, which would have forbidden, it passed, forbidden police from making arrests for minor offenses and then deporting people. And in that, we brought forth numerous texts and rituals as reminders that we've been immigrants as Jews for all of our history. So we can't stand idly by on that issue. And one can say that on many other issues, I don't care whether the Supreme Court says the Second Amendment means that everybody has a right to bear a gun. A, there are a lot of the people who don't think that's what it means. And B, is that right? Does that right overcome people's right to live in a safe community, or shop in a safe mall, or go to a safe school? And to sit by and say, "Well, but they're so powerful." Well, the Klan was powerful too once, and one shouldn't make comparisons. But if the Klan could be defeated, so can the NRA.
Rabbi Levy, I know I've taken a lot of your time.
No,
but are there questions or things that you want to bring out that we haven't talked about?
Well, memory is one of them. As we get older, that often becomes less and less of a strength. And but I've come to feel that what survives in one's memory has a value, whether it was exactly as it happened. We're not historians. We're not data gatherers. We're rabbis, people who both experience things, who help other people experience things. And coming back here 50 years later, as I had said, it has really helped to show the significance of things. I mean, I guess, as a historian, that's why you read and write history. So you can reflect on it afterward and ask, is this what it meant? Did it mean something else? And what does it mean for the present? I mean, I think I've said all along, once this whole process of bringing us back here started, was that I, for one, didn't want this just to be an exercise in nostalgia, that it needed to be also a reminder of what are the other causes that are worth going to jail for, and to look at that question.
Well, and this reminds me, this is one of the reasons we've been so excited at the University of Florida to be able to share these interviews with our students and to think about, because we're always, as historians, we have a hard time with the meaning and the feeling questions, right? We can get the dates, we can do the what's and how's and so on and so forth. But that's why I think we've talked so much about the kind of the subjective, because that's so much of what we're interested in. Because we can get the dates from the Record or SCLC or Anti-Defamation League. I mean, there's a lot of a big paper trail, but what we don't have is kind of the heart trail in many ways. But and then you bring up also, what does it mean after all these years, and what does it mean coming back here? That's a really profound question and experience. I can't even imagine how you felt when you first arrived in St. Augustine. It must have been something else.
It was, and as I say, last night to see the St. Augustine sign that I never thought I would see again was just very interesting. And look, I read newspapers. I know some of the things that go on in Florida, not necessarily here. Voter suppression. How is that different from what was going on 50 years ago? Are we really willing to sit back and let all of these states keep people from voting on the theory that it keeps out voter fraud when there's no evidence of voter fraud? So, think, as you know, problems just appear in different guises, and the great error is not to see the guise is not to see that they're just guises, but that they're similar problems.
Exactly. Could I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a singer, and so I have to ask about the
Thanks, God.
role of music in the movement.
Oh, my heavens.
And Rabbi Hanan shared a couple of moments. I just wanted your reflections on. One was when you first got there, you were being held in the sun out in the holding tank, apparently, or holding area.
No, there was a shaded area.
But and anyway, you were separate from the African Americans, and so, but he said he heard singing.
Yes.
That somehow you were aware of each other's group. Maybe that speak to that moment of just.
Sure. I mean, my memory is that we were together outside, and there was a shaded area, and we were schmoosing outside. I mean, they were talking. The black civil rights workers were talking about their experiences in Albany, Georgia, and other places where they had been with King. And we were just getting to know each other. Then, when they booked us, we were booked in separate cells. But as I said, that there was a window in the cell where the blacks were, and I was standing outside talking with some of them. But when we got into the jail, then yes, we heard up and down the stairways. "We Shall Overcome" was one, and I was going to say I couldn't sing that song for years without my eyes welling up They welled up this morning. We sang it in the service outside. And there were other spirituals also. But we shall over, and this is in some ways irrelevant, but I went to a very progressive camp as a teenager, and this was in the early to mid-50s, and we sang "We Shall Overcome" there as part. I mean, there was a lot of folk singing, and so when that became the sort of anthem of the civil rights movement, I know that song. And hearing it in the stairwells of the jail was like the newspaper accounts, suddenly jumping to life as in Harry Potter. Oh, I'm getting this experience too. And, it's a powerful song.
And then in terms of your own solidarity, I know you were kind of booked in stages coming in, and Avinu Shalom Aleichem, was that something that was, do you remember that being sung by the rabbis?
I don't remember that.
Okay.
I don't remember that. No, the only song that I remember was "We Shall Overcome." But my memory is not so good for things yesterday.
Just one last thing.
But music in the whole movement was obviously very important. Both spirituals. King used spirituals. And he wouldn't sing them, but the way he intoned them. His speech in Washington, "Great God, Almighty, free, my God." So that what he taught us and what black preachers know themselves, you can intone a song without singing it and still have it lift the rafters. So, no, the music was very important.
And my last thing of just following up on one other, the nonviolent. Did Dr. King have any special instructions in terms of nonviolence?
What I remember is only that we weren't to walk into the patrol cars on our own, but that we were to go limp and have the police carry us. And it was understood we weren't to fight back. None of us would have done that. But also, I'm assuming that we all had read enough of this to know that nonviolence is the other side of violence, and that part of the purpose of that nonviolence is both a philosophy and a strategy, and that it knows that it will provoke violence, and that will increase the credibility of those who are nonviolent, and that you lose that once you join in the violence as well. So, the hoses and the cattle prods, were all, as it were, weapons on our side to have people, to push people to realize how violent things were, and that if we had fought back, all of that would have been lost. So, we all understood that, and you just look the book and the movie of Gandhi. Gandhi understood that brilliantly, and King was very much a disciple of his. For Jews, this whole issue became rife a few years later, after the Six-Day War, where Israel, nonviolence is based on the notion that your opponent will use reasonable, humane principles. And that's why Gandhi felt he could do it with the British, and that King felt he could do it in America, as violent as Bull Connor and the Klan here were. But when you have people out to destroy your whole nation, can you really use nonviolence? Nonviolence might have worked in the early 30s against the Nazis, but not after Hitler took power. And so that became a whole issue. You know, to what extent does nonviolence work for us? So it became a philosophical issue, and I mean, the court is still out. That doesn't deal with your question about music. But I think in this context, one could argue that music helps to channel one's own violent instincts. And that instead of getting angry at the people who are beating you, to sing can just take you to another place.
Well, thank you very much
Thank
for your
you.
time.
Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful questions.
All right.